All right, today's video is probably going to make some people angry, but quite frankly, I really don't care because in my view, Assassin's Creed Shadows is getting a ridiculous and excessive amount of hate from the gaming community, a lot of which it just doesn't actually deserve. Now, just to get something straight from the very beginning, there certainly are a multitude of things to criticize about the game, some of which I'll discuss soon, but for some reason, I have suspicions about what those reasons are, but for right now, that's less important. For some reason, this game is now a lightning rod for what feels like the most absurd, vitriolic, and asinine critique that I've seen from the video game community in years, with a certain cohort of creators and their dedicated fans grasping at every single straw that they can find in order to reinforce the narrative that this game is a colossal failure. Spoiler, it's not. I wouldn't call it Game of the Year, not by any stretch. Ghost of Tsushima was better, obviously, but it's got a few things going for it, with marginal success in tow. And I think it's important to acknowledge that Ubisoft is in a bit of an unwinnable situation. For years, people have claimed that their development cycle is stagnating, they lack innovation, and never break new ground. But at the same time, with Shadows, when they appear to actually try and correct those issues, they get slammed for making changes that people don't like with some of the fastest moving goalposts that I've ever seen. It's not even goalposts at this point, it's just an infinitely expanding target, where everything they do is bad and the game is a terrible failure, even though it's objectively not. Quick side note, I sound sick right now in this video because I'm very sick. I was actually in Japan when this game came out. I absolutely loved it there, by the way. Everything positive that I've heard about the country is 100% true. But then on the way home, I got sick with a head cold. You might be thinking, then just rest, bro, do the video later, but I've been back a couple of days. I'm sitting here bored out of my mind. And even though I'm sick, I feel like doing content again, like I just want to. So sorry about the voice, it is what it is. Sounding sick and struggling a little bit to read is probably better than just sitting on my couch for yet another 24 hours, so yeah, that's why I sound terrible. Anyway, Assassin's Creed Shadows has finally released, and believe it or not, I'm about to defend the game, to a degree. Here's the format. I'm going to start by giving an example of valid criticism, and then I'm going to complement that example by showcasing something which is, in my opinion, invalid. I'll go back and forth a little bit, a few times at least. By the end of it, hopefully, I'll have made my case that while there are certainly good reasons to refuse supporting the game, or Ubisoft for that matter, generally speaking, this extremely vocal and seemingly growing subset of the gaming community, primarily the anti-woke content creator sphere and their followers, have completely lost the plot, as they now scream about things which hold zero merit simply because they are incapable of self-reflection, intellectual honesty, or admitting that none of this ever had anything to do with real principles. This was about clicks. It was about ad revenue in particular, in much the same way that crowd has now gone totally silent on the subject of Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, which was a massive financial success and Game of the Year contender as well. They'll probably go silent about Shadows sometime soon, because it simply isn't the failure that they claim. And thus, the most important part of all of this, it can't be used as a bludgeon against whatever target they pick next time. Let's get to it. First example of what is, in my opinion, extremely valid criticism. Yasuke, the joint main character, protagonist of the game, absolutely sucks. Ubisoft, more so than probably any other entry in the Assassin's Creed franchise, tiptoed a lot closer this time to the idea of historical accuracy, choosing, for the first time ever, I think, to make an actual historical figure playable. Just one problem, and I have an extremely detailed other video about all of this, which I'll link down below. Just one problem, which is that Yasuke appears to be a sort of highly exaggerated fan fiction construct from the mind of a single individual historian named Thomas Lockley. The specifics are difficult here, but the gist of it, without making the video 45 minutes long, is that Thomas Lockley spent a tremendous amount of time and effort single-handedly propping up a sort of legendary samurai status for Yasuke, which doesn't really exist, we don't think. As a result, combined with the fact that Ubisoft has been more vocal about historical accuracy this time than pretty much ever before, the community began rightly criticizing the inclusion of Yasuke, especially under these suspect parameters, which I believe is the seed from which this overwhelmingly negative discourse originated. See, to me, that's valid criticism, especially for people who actually understood the specifics pre-release. However, that was then and this is now, which are decidedly different situations because now the game has actually been released. It turns out you can basically just not play as Yasuke. The joint main character feature that Ubisoft has now further emphasized compared to previous entries in the series lets you swap in and out pretty much at will, which makes it so that instead of using the wildly out of place, historically disputed, bumbling, clunky, Hulk esque brawler, which feels completely asinine in the world of Assassin's Creed, you can just play as Nawi. Nawi is the other playable main character, the shinobi. She's quick, agile, solid voice acting, decent animations. Some of them are really good, actually. Some of the cutscenes and animations are great, and then other times they stand out in a weird way. But overall, I'm pleasantly surprised. And if you took this game, right? This is the important part. If you took this game, literally just deleted Yasuke, just deleted him completely, and then relaunched it afterward, I don't think there would be even a fraction of the hate that it's currently getting. But see, that's an issue because why on earth, in a post release environment where we now understand the distinctly different playstyles of these two characters, with the added impact of not really being required to play very much as whichever one you dislike, why are we still clinging to the fact that Yasuke sucks in order to say the game is a total failure? I agree wholeheartedly that Yasuke is garbage. He can barely climb walls, he doesn't even have eagle vision, navigating the world with him is a chore, and watching him run through solid wood castle doors is just a complete joke. It's somebody's power fiction fantasy type thing, and it's just decidedly stupid, okay? Especially because he doesn't even have a silent assassination in Assassin's fucking Creed. But guess what? Nobody has to play as him. For anyone who likes the idea of a playable character that has less utility, less movement, and basically hulks out in the middle of feudal Japan in a way that makes literally no sense whatsoever, go right ahead, okay? All power to you. But as with pretty much everything else in this game, it is optional. Back when the game was still on the horizon, when we didn't know what it would eventually look like, criticizing it over the impending debacle of Yasuke feels kind of doable or defensible. Some people certainly went overboard to that effect, and it's very clear to me now that there were some racist undertones to the argument for a few people. But before we knew what the game really was, concern over Yasuke's implementation in that world felt much more understandable. However, now that we see what Ubisoft has actually made, why are people so angry over the existence of choices? This is an RPG. You can dislike Yasuke and then not play him. In fact, for anyone who was concerned over Yasuke subtracting from the traditional Assassin's Creed atmosphere, which he does, why is the outrage still there? Just play as the actual assassin. Kind of case closed, right? I find it exceedingly strange now, and I don't know when precisely the shift happened. Sometime recently, but I couldn't put my finger on when. But people now appear to be viscerally angry that a choice they don't like even exists in the first place. I can understand that outrage when the player is forced to do something, but when did we switch over from don't force me to play as something I don't want to in a franchise where I have certain expectations to don't you dare even create something I don't like, even if I never have to engage with it hardly at all? Why is that happening? In my view, and this is purely just personal opinion, criticism or outrage over Yasuke has rapidly become invalid now. Perhaps on the subject of historical accuracy based on prior statements for a small subset of the player base, it might still matter, but Assassin's Creed is intrinsically fictional. Time travel, aliens, I won't go down the road of animus lore here, but historical accuracy in any real sense of the word is kind of a non starter. People seem very concerned about how Yasuke can romance certain other characters or how there's a non binary interaction of some kind, and I would agree with people if any of that was ever forced on the player. But Ubisoft put in an entire separate mode of the game called Canon Mode. You can select an experience that removes those choices entirely from the main menu before you even start the overall experience, which leaves me baffled, honestly, because people are still genuinely outraged over the existence of characters and choices that they never even have to basically see. Feel free to chime in down below in the comment section if you want to, but how does that really make sense? I could talk about this for quite some time. For anyone who's not aware of this, I used to criticize games often for shoehorned diversity and political narratives like 7 or 8 years ago. And now watching this new age of anti-woke content creator basically parrot watered down or much less articulated talking points well and truly after the tide seems to have shifted feels kind of weird. At the same time, that was 7 or 8 years ago, so maybe I just grew up. Anyway, criticism of Yasuke in some respects is understandable, and certainly was understandable. But now, post release, it feels a little bit more hollow, and in my opinion, kind of invalid. What's next? Next is cultural respect, which is a tricky one because I'm not Japanese. Having recently been there for a few weeks, thankfully, I'm also not the type of person who assumes to know everything about a place that I merely visited and barely scratched the surface of. Despite having recently been there, I'm just flatly not qualified to speak on this, but I'll try to keep it confined within the portions that I do know and somewhat understand. Having talked about Yasuke, including some of the choices that can be made with him, which pertain to real historical figures, some of them, if those are what people find to be offensive, I would once again like to mention canon mode, which is purpose built to remove all of that from your experience entirely. But beyond that, there's a lot of blunders that Ubisoft has made. At one point, they were using incorrect samurai clan symbols. They used material that they didn't own the copyright for, which was a pretty big blunder. They had a one-legged torii gate on a figurine of Yasuke, which is closely tied to an iconic shrine in Nagasaki. And more recently, the topic of shrines came into question itself after a clip went viral on social media of Yasuke destroying one of them in-game. This is where it gets tricky. Ubisoft has very obviously made blunders here, but let's focus on the shrine angle more specifically, because that one seems to be the most high profile, even attracting a response from the Japanese Prime Minister. For starters, Yasuke is a joke of a character. He literally runs through things, destroying them in a way that makes him totally abhorrent to me in a game about stealth and assassination. But with that out of the way, right, just being super clear on it, a large portion of the in-game world itself is a destructible environment. There was no mission to destroy that shrine. It was simply the product of someone choosing to do so, and immediately following the backlash over all of this, Ubisoft announced a day one patch that would make certain portions of the game world non-destroyable. Certain NPCs and specific sections of buildings will no longer be part of the overall destructible environment, but let's take a minute here and just be honest with ourselves, okay? Is this really some sort of insane cultural disrespect on the part of Ubisoft? Think about it. They made a fully populated game world, and then small items in that game world are destructible as just a basic framework. That's it. Because of that blanket development technique for the entire world, you could, not forced to, or ever even incentivized to, by the way, you optionally could, if you went and found it in order to do so, you could destroy the objects inside a shrine. And when confronted over this, which they were, with a statement from the Prime Minister about disrespect, there was a day one patch to solve it. Does that really sound like big bad Ubisoft is intentionally disrespecting culture? Because I don't really see it that way. Funnily enough, most people that I see getting outraged by this are doing so on behalf of Japanese culture when they themselves have no part of it. So again, I'm not qualified to say where the line should be drawn, but a destructible world being made by a major development studio, like a blanket destructible world across the entire game, with no incentive to target certain areas, which also happen to fall under the same mechanical guidelines, and then fixing the issue as soon as true dissatisfaction is expressed, doesn't really feel like some sort of insane disrespect on the part of Ubisoft. Again, they've made blunders that they can certainly be criticized for, but in Assassin's Creed 2, you literally take down the Pope. It's not like Ubisoft is coming out of the woodwork here and doing something with the explicit goal of snubbing people's faith. To be fair, I'm not telepathic, so I guess I shouldn't say that with absolute certainty. But I just can't picture this being intentional. I see carelessness, not animosity. How about another one? Microtransactions. On the list of things that warrant criticism, this is probably my go-to example, and Ubisoft sucks when it comes to monetizing their games. Assassin's Creed Shadows is a full-priced, greedily monetized format with a full shop and all sorts of additional techniques for extracting what's called recurrent user spending. Of course, microtransactions in general are a foregone conclusion now. We lost that battle decidedly as a gaming community, but Ubisoft goes a few steps further, right? They always like creep a little bit down that road. I think it was Odyssey, yeah, where they first did something like this, but they actually appeared to have throttled down the experience rewards, right, for Odyssey in that game, and then remedied the self-inflicted problem by selling a permanent 50% XP boost in the microtransaction shop. That's insane, and I will never step in to defend them for shit like that. But as much as I dislike the monetization mechanisms for Shadows as well, the fact that they focus so heavily on recurrent user spending through microtransactions is a really interesting segue into some invalid criticism. There's a group of content creators, I'm not going to mention them by name, their audiences are exceedingly irritating lately, but there's a group of creators who are repeatedly claiming that Assassin's Creed Shadows is a financial failure. Disregard the fact that the game has 3 million players already so far, and it's the best launch ever for a game in the entire franchise, second only to Valhalla, which came out at the apex of the COVID-19 video game industry boom, which is a black swan event. But anyway, disregard all of that, because apparently the Steam charts don't have a super high player count number. And apparently the fact that they're saying 3 million players and not 3 million sales is evidence that the game is a failure, and thus Ubisoft is a failure. Here's the thing, if you make 30 videos in 6 months just repeatedly condemning the game with half of them identical headlines and as much vitriol as you can possibly insert into those videos, and you're saying it's the next big failure in video games over and over and over, if those videos get millions upon millions of views, thus earning tens of thousands of dollars, and if criticizing that game is the single largest bump in revenue, traction, and subscriber growth that you've ever seen on your channel, what happens when you're wrong? Short answer, if you're wrong, you're just not wrong. You can't be wrong. When you're part of the current generation anti-woke phalanx, if you will, you cannot ever admit that you were wrong. It helps that they're all standing shoulder to shoulder with each other, making money every single step of the way. But when a game like Shadows comes out, and it's plenty successful, you have to just pretend it's not. Thankfully, Ubisoft is a very easy target for them. Ubisoft is on a downward trend, they've lost player support, they've lost shareholder support in particular, and most recently they had to secure a special subsidiary deal with Tencent, infusing over $1 billion at 25% equity, I believe, for their major franchises, spinning them off into a different company, just to stay operational. This is what's called a Pyrrhic victory for them, because it's certainly a victory, resulting in the company continuing on with significant runway while avoiding the prospect of losing control or being subjected to some sort of hostile takeover. But it's a victory that comes at a time, and with such a cost, it's not exactly a moment for celebration. However, the argument that I see plastered everywhere right now is that Assassin's Creed Shadows was the final nail in Ubisoft's coffin. They needed this game to be a success, this was their last hope, and it failed. But with every ounce of sincerity that I can muster here, anyone who's saying that is kind of a fucking moron. Fixating on the fact that Ubisoft is saying 3 million players instead of sales figures, even when those sales figures are likely well in excess of 2 million copies already, because the game is primarily console-based and thus Steam charts is probably the dumbest way to try and measure its success. Fixating on the discrepancy between players and sales, those two words, is a losing perspective, because like we just said in the valid portion of criticism, Ubisoft builds out their games to maximize recurrent user microtransaction spending. Assassin's Creed Shadows is no different. 3 million players means 3 million people in the game world being subjected to their sales funnels, which they do have, by the way. They do the whole, you earn some free currency quickly, but it's not enough for anything cool type of trick, and all sorts of other psychological tactics. But the point I'm trying to make is that arguing this game's success or failure on the sticking point of, but they said 3 million players, not 3 million sales, is brain dead. The game is performing very well, no question there, and it's not the most successful entry in the Assassin's Creed franchise because of Valhalla and the Black Swan event, but it's the second most, and it comes at a time when they're spinning off franchises anyway while saving the business, which leaves me completely flabbergasted, I love that word, at why and especially how people are so intent on criticizing Ubisoft that they're just resorting to making things up. How about some icing on the metaphorical cake? People were getting up in arms and condemning Ubisoft yet again because the credits for this game are over 2 hours long. Is that a completely absurd length? Yes. Can games be made with a fraction of the resources, rivaling the quality at every turn? Also a resounding yes. But why on earth are we stooping that low in an effort to put down a game which is really genuinely not as bad as people said it would be? It reeks of desperation. Yes, Ubisoft is probably wasting insane amounts of money on dev positions that don't need to be there, across studios that have very little impact. If you want evidence of that happening, just think back to Skull and Bones. That's a whole different disaster. But why is that one of the sticking points? Game bad because too many people worked on the game? How does that make sense? It feels like we're witnessing the death of nuance right now. People get so entrenched in a position before something even comes out because of culture war brain rot primarily, they just can't be objective when it finally does. Sure, there's monetary incentives in play as well, but that honestly feels like a choice. You can criticize a game for what you see in the pre release format, certainly, but when it finally comes out and doesn't have some of the problems that you expected it to have, or when it gets delayed and genuinely fixes some of the impending issues, you are allowed to change your opinion. That is okay to do. Instead of manufacturing reasons inauthentically why the game is a failure, when it really truly objectively is not one, maybe we can try taking in new information and rationally articulating why we perhaps don't like it ourselves, but are positively surprised by the way things changed or the stuff that they got right, instead of radicalizing along political lines before, during, and even after the product is released. Maybe we just look at what the product is, evaluate it for what it actually is. It doesn't have to be team sports. It can be, is the game good? But when the new age anti woke content creator army, because it is kind of a little army at this point, is making this much money with this much support, I find myself dejectedly assuming that common reason is a bit of a lost cause. I think the motivation is profit. I think they pick a target, they attack as hard as possible, doubling and tripling, quadrupling down if it results in clicks, subscribers, and revenue, and then they just roll the dice on whether or not any of it is defensible in the aftermath. If it's not, such as Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, the most recent example, they get real quiet real fast and they just walk away. If it is, they hold it up as a perpetual example of gamers winning against the woke mind virus. But in the case of Shadows, they went so hard for so long that even now, when they are proven wrong, they cling to it for a final gasp of, look, I was right, even though they were not right about it, before moving on to the next target. Again, maybe it's because over the span of 7 or 8 years, I just kind of grew up. But looking around me now, I don't see productive critique of gaming trends as much anymore. I see profit motivated outrage, with little to no self reflection, where the only outcome is to bury the more legitimate problems under a deluge of manufactured garbage. It's not healthy. It doesn't help the industry. And it certainly doesn't end well if that type of shallow concern ends up being kind of the mainstream sticking points. Hopefully it changes. That's it. That's my effort to articulate why I'm actually not disappointed with Assassin's Creed Shadows as much as I thought I would be. Actually, I'm not really disappointed at all. I kind of like it. Despite some real severe problems, it does have issues. And this time, as opposed to my previous video on Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, I tried a lot harder to extend an olive branch and be more neutral. I think a lot of people outraged over this game, adamantly claiming it's a failure and condemning it 6 ways to Sunday for reasons they simply heard from social media, are brain dead and they're beneath the rest of us. But you get more flies with honey, and I don't really need to spike my blood pressure over all this. In the end, Assassin's Creed Shadows is a mixed bag with a lot of problems, but there's some real decent fun to be had, and there are redeeming qualities. And I plan on doing a full review when I'm finally done with it, but I have no idea when that'll be. Some great systems here, some good choices, and an actual attempt at innovation from Ubisoft, which maybe misses the mark in some respects, and obviously it's over monetized in a lot of their different decisions I disagree with, but at least they actually tried something. I have to stand up and commend them for that. They tried to break out of that formula. They did some different things. They took risks. I mean, you can't just hate them no matter what they do. Sometimes you have to give them some credit. If you want to support the channel, check out the links down below. Locals and Patreon, best ways for sure. A special VPN deal, big discount on that. Merchandise, social media, etc., etc. But I'll cut it there and stop rambling. As always, thank you all for watching. Question everything, and have a nice night.